Hey everyone, Dockwell here, and welcome to another one of my Dota 2 hero guides. Today we're going to be taking a look at Omniknight. Up until recently, Omniknight was a hero that played support, and he functioned like a backline healer save type of hero, who essentially had a free BKB that you could apply to allies. He also had an AoE ultimate that saved everybody from physical damage. However, over the past year or two, Omniknight has been changed and buffed and adjusted here and there to become more of an offensive offlaner type of hero, where he focuses more on doing damage to single targets while also being extremely tanky and hard to bring down. So his abilities are now focused more on buffing himself rather than saving allies or buffing allies. In this way, Omniknight kind of works like Legion Commander, in the sense that Legion and Omni both have abilities that can help and save teammates, but for the most part, you're going to be using those abilities on yourself to buff yourself and allow yourself to pick off enemies or frontline for your team better. But before we can understand how to play Omniknight, we have to take a look at his abilities. So now that we understand Omniknight in general, we can take a look at his abilities and see how he's able to be that good offensive burst damage offlaner that's also very tanky and annoying to deal with, like I talked about. So first, we're going to take a look at Purification, and this ability is pretty straightforward. You can actually cast it on an ally or a creep or yourself, allied creep, not like a jungle creep or anything like that, or an enemy creep, but you can cast it on any friendly unit, and it heals and also does damage in an AoE. So let's take some damage here from this axe, and I'll show you how it heals. And it heals for a good amount of health, and it does a significant amount of damage because it is a pure damage ability, which is always going to be good because it scales pretty well into the late game. Obviously, the numbers don't get any bigger once you max out the ability, but it can't be reduced by magic resistance or armor like magic damage abilities or physical damage abilities or right clicks. So it just is very good for scaling in that way. Also keep in mind that it is an AoE ability around the Omniknight or the hero or whoever you are casting this on, but it's a very, very short range ability. So you can see I just clip the axe right there, but if I'm like this far away, we'll put free spells on, it doesn't actually hit from this far away. So just keep in mind it's basically melee range, like a little bit further than melee range, like almost basically the melee range of a Monkey King or something like that. So you do have to be pretty close to the enemy if you're going to want to dish damage, or you can cast it on an ally that jumps in, like a melee carry or something like that, or you can cast it on creeps, when someone's trying to last hit or whatever. It can be an ability that has many different uses, but it's pretty straightforward in understanding what it actually does. So that's Purification. Very good. Scales pretty well into the late game. Good for saving, good for healing in the laning stage, all that kind of stuff, and just dishing out some damage and harassing. Then we have Repel, which is a very good defensive ability. This is one of his main defensive abilities. And this essentially gives you a free BKB. Now, in the past, BKB was something where you cast it on yourself and you just got complete immunity from all spells. You couldn't even cast spells on people, but that's really not how it works these days. Now you can actually get spells cast on you, and they still sort of debuff you, but they don't have the same effect. You take a lot less magic damage and stuff like that, and you also don't get slowed or any of those kinds of things. You don't get stunned, even though you have that debuff on you, and that's significant for Omni because basically, if we see, you actually get bonus strength and regen. You get kind of flat regen and strength, but you also get more if there's more debuffs on you. So I can show you this. If I cast Repel on myself here, you can see I have more regen and more health, but then if this axe casts a debuff on me, I actually get more regen overall, and I can cast it again. I get more regen and more health overall when I have those buffs or debuffs on me. So that's actually like good for the hero in the sense that now not only are you running away from all these stuns, you can't really be affected by all that stuff, but if people try to cast abilities on you, it's actually just bad for them to do that. And then you can also, cast this ability after they've casted all those debuffs on you, which is really, really good. Now, obviously, you can't do this when you're silenced, so keep that in mind because that's a debuff as well. But that's kind of just one of these things that makes this hero really, really hard to bring down because you almost don't want to cast much stuff on him if he can just click Repel, because that makes him even stronger yet and even harder to kill yet when you're doing that. And you can also cast this on allies as well, which is very good. Now, for the most part, like I said, you're going to want to cast a lot of these abilities on yourself these days, but you still have that option, which is always very, very good. Then we have Hammer of Purity. It's a pretty close AoE ability, so it doesn't have a lot of cast range, but this is really, really good for just straight up doing damage. It's another pure damage ability, so this here does a lot of pure damage, and it's just a single target ability. You just cast it on the axe, and boom, there it goes. He takes damage, and it also scales a lot better into the late game. Obviously, this is kind of flat damage, and this scales a lot based on your base damage, which is good because the more items and strength and stuff like that you buy, the better it's going to be, and the more damage that you can actually do. And this also what works well with Conda and some of these these other items that have been introduced these days to just scale up in that way, so that this ability is just straight up like doing half of people's health later in the game, which is kind of insane. And there's also one other aspect, is it does provide a movement slow there for a little bit, so that's also very good, because then you can stick on the targets, usually run in or blink in, cast this ability almost immediately, and then they basically cannot move. It's hard for them to run away, and you can run them down because you're a relatively fast hero overall. Omniknight is. So Hammer of Purity, really good. This is basically the ability that they gave him recently that made him more of an offensive hero and scaling into the late game, just doing more single target burst damage. So that's Hammer of Purity. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Guardian Angel. This is the ultimate that they also changed recently, where it used to just be kind of like an AoE ultimate where you cast it and everybody on your team gets immune from right-click damage. And now there's 2 charges and it's a single target ability. So it's not as good in terms of team fighting and just pressing it and making everybody immune, but it's very good for yourself because you can click this on yourself, and then you have a decent, duration of straight up just not taking right-click damage. And this also works with his repel. So you can basically click this, and now it's like, well, I literally just cannot die. Like, this is just impossible for me to die, essentially. And obviously that doesn't last for very long. You have 2 charges of these. So basically, if you turn off free spells, I can cast this, and then, it lasts for a decent amount of time. I can also refresh it with this, which you probably don't really necessarily want to cast both of them on yourself at the same time, but you can do that if you want, and increase the duration of that. But yeah, you just have multiple things that you can do at different times and combine this together to be basically unkillable, insanely tanky, and then you're also dishing out a ton of damage as well. And then we're going to move on to the Ags and the Ags Shard, which actually the Ags Shard is probably better than the Ags, to be honest, because the Ags is honestly barely ever bought. It's really not a focus of the hero these days, because the Ags just grants an extra global cast range on the Guardian Angel, which is very good. Now you can kind of give it to a lot of your team and it can be effective in the game, but people don't really get it because this hero isn't focused as much on support. It's more focused on Hammer of Purity and just jumping in and bursting people down. And this gives you basically a second Hammer of Purity. So you can use the first one, but then the second one you use is essentially when you right-click an enemy, and there's like a cooldown for that. So basically, and you're also getting healed too, so now you also have this. So essentially what you can do on the hero is, you can see the build that's typical here, is you buy Blink, and you kind of jump in, and what you do is you just jump in, you can right-click then you can use this, then you can heal, and you can see how much damage you do, and Echo Saber is another ability or another item that you get that has like this, double attack ability. So you can attack twice, you slow them, you use this, you slow them. Like, they're just giga slowed, they can't move. You're doing insane pure damage. You can see how this hero can be extremely annoying and just burst down supports full to 0 and even cores at times too, which is kind of crazy. If you have squishy low HP cores that you can just jump in and burst them before they even know what to do, unless they press BKB or do something else or jump out, they have a mobility spell. But yeah, this hero can just be super annoying and crazy to deal with. And so that's Omniknight. Those are his abilities. Now let's jump into a game and see how he's played. Omniknight's laning stage is relatively simple. He really just functions as a traditional strength melee offlaner in that he's fairly tanky, but doesn't offer too much offensive threat until he gets a couple levels and the laning stage progresses to the later portion of that lane where he can just, have more points in his abilities so they do more damage, and he can be tankier because of some items and those kinds of things. Now, sure, if he's paired with the right support or he's against a weak laner, a lane combo, he can get aggressive early on, but that's usually not the case. You kind of just want to be a little bit passive, maybe using your abilities offensively to get some, damage on the enemy when they get close to the creeps, or using your Hammer of Purity to last at a range creep or something like that. Of course, you can always do those things, but then later in the game, later in the laning stage is when he wants to get more aggressive. So then your main timing is once you hit level 6, because once you hit that 6 timing, then you have basically immunity to physical damage, which is really, really good for getting aggressive and diving towers. Now, you may not want to do that right at level 6, but sometime between like 6, 7, and 8, once you hit those timings, you can really dive towers, be annoying for the enemy. They almost always have to retreat and just give up the lane, give up that tower, unless they bring like 4 heroes or something like that. So do be wary if they do that, because you're not like infinitely tanky at that point in the game, because you're not going to be putting a lot of points into repel early on. But it is one of those things with, you and the support especially, and if it's just the carry and the other support like the 5 position or something, there's just no way they can deal with you when you just don't take tower damage, you don't take right click damage, and you're just going to be dishing out a ton of damage with your spells and even healing as well. So just keep in mind that's what you want to do. That's your timing, and you want to get aggressive at that end of the laning stage into that early game timing and just kind of push your advantage. Now, you're not as tanky as maybe a Bristleback or a Timbersaw or something like that. So keep in mind, you can get turned on, like I said, when they bring a lot of heroes. So just don't go too crazy with it, but you're not really a great jungle farmer or like stack farmer. You can maybe do it, but you just want to put yourself in offensive positions because of how tanky you are and how much damage you do early on, and that's what you want to take advantage of. Then, once you have a few items in the mid game, you're really going to want to focus on jumping targets and bursting them down, because that's really what Omni is effective at these days. His pure damage cannot be underestimated, especially if you're snowballing. So that's kind of why I said earlier on, once you hit the end of the laning stage into that early game, you want to be aggressive. You kind of want to farm heroes if you can and not farm creeps as much. Now, sure, you're going to want to push waves when you can, maybe jungle a little bit, but you're really going to want to farm heroes, because if you can snowball, if you can get that blink, if you can get some of those items that make you do even more damage and just jump targets, if there's a support alone, or if there's even a carry farming the jungle alone and he doesn't have backup, if you just jump in maybe with one other hero with a stun, you're going to be able to burst them down. That's really how you snowball the game and get even fatter and do even more damage and become super hard to deal with in the game overall. Then in team fights, it's always important to consider what targets you want to jump and which ones you can effectively bring down, because sometimes you can dish out enough damage to literally one-shot mids or carries, especially before they get a ton of items, but sometimes it's going to be better, especially maybe later on in the game when they do have items, to focus the squishy supports in the back line, because they're going to have, less defenses and you can really just burst them down. They're usually not buying tanky items. Yeah, maybe some escapes, but you can usually run them down, slow them, so that it doesn't even matter. You can just get on top of them and kill them, especially with your kind of free BKB. And so right from the start, they don't have a position 5, they don't have a position 4, you can run after the supports and then deal with the cores later, because you just kind of snowball in this way. Unless, they are just bringing you down over time, it's really, really hard to deal with you, especially if they don't have any of those supports. So as you can see, when played correctly, Omniknight can be one of the most annoying heroes in the game, and it's not just because he does ridiculous burst damage like I've talked about, but also because he can be nearly impossible to bring down with that repel and that ultimate and that free BKB and tons of regen and tons of HP, especially if they just are throwing a ton of debuffs at you and you just have all those, and now it's like, oh well, great, you can't bring me down, I just have infinite regen. So this hero can make it feel like you're just one of the tankiest heroes in the game. That's really what this hero can feel like in the right matchup, in the right game, if you're really snowballing. And then add that pure damage in there, and it just becomes this crazy concoction of just being one of the most powerful heroes if it's in the right circumstance. And he also has that added effect of being able to cast abilities on allies as well. Like I talked about that a little bit, and so you're going to want to recognize the games when you're not just super annoying, super tanky, bursting people down, and you still can have effectiveness even if it's not the best Omni game, or you're not having the best snowball game. You can still buff up your carry, you can buff up your mid, and give them an easier time to win the game for you. And then lastly, for like counters of Omniknight, you just need to be careful about two main things. The first is just kind of when you're casting repel, when you're casting your ultimate, make sure you're using them at the right time and you're not just like wasting them for no reason. If you're going to get stunned, you're going to take magic damage, of course, cast repel, get in there, run people down with that, or use it to run away. But if you're just fighting a carry, that repel is maybe not going to do as much. Maybe save it for another time, because your ultimate is going to be more effective. So yes, you can use them both at the same time, but sometimes that might be a waste, and so you need to be a little bit careful picking and choosing when you use those cooldowns, because then if it's off cooldown, then you can be a lot weaker. So you need to be careful about that, kind of think through when you're going to be using these abilities. And then along the same lines, you really, really need to be careful when enemies have dispels that they can use offensively, or the enemy core like a carry has bought nullifier, and that's usually not till later in the game, so you don't have to worry about that till later. But once that's it's a 40 minutes in or something and the enemy carry has nullifier, you really need to be careful, because if they jump on you and they use that, there's really not much you can do to save yourself. Sure, you can turn and try to burst them down and do some damage, but you're all about kind of the surprise, the hit in the beginning and just bursting them full to zero, getting that jump on them. And so if you're just like trying to man fight people with Omniknight, that's really not going to be effective, especially when they have nullifier like I talked about. So those are the things you need to be careful of, especially later on in the game as Omniknight. And that, everyone, is my Omniknight guide. If you liked the video or found it helpful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.